Hello, everyone. In this lecture, I want to talk about Act 2 of A Raisin in the Sun. And just to quickly summarize the main action or the main events from Act 1. Remember, in Act 1, we met the Younger family, a black family in Chicago. Their living condition is less than ideal, to be charitable. It's quite awful, to be honest. This is a play that grapples with the limited opportunities for people of color in the United States. And in particular, it seems to want to have this conversation about the connection or the link between social and political opportunity and housing. And it's about more than that, of course, but that seems to be one of the main conceits of the play. And I'll talk about that more today, in particular with Mama and her explanation of why she used this insurance check to buy this house in this much nicer neighborhood. But in addition to wanting to dramatize the difficulty of the housing situation in Chicago in the middle of the 20th century. This is also a play about generational conflict and generational misunderstandings. Mama, for example, I spoke about this in the last lecture. She represents this, at least from certain perspectives, from Benita's perspective, from Walter's perspective, this antiquated way of thinking and seeing the world. And all of these characters have these distinct impressions about what freedom, and if we just wanted to generalize, what a good life for Black people in the United States looks like. Mama, if you recall from Act 1, she spoke about how just fleeing the American South and having a situation where her body wasn't literally in peril from one day to the next, that was the goal. But her children, Walter, Benita, they want more. And the question that I encouraged you to think about is, well, is she right or is she wrong? Because I think you could argue, and I think Walter would argue this, I think Benita would argue this, progress needs, and our understanding of what progress is, that too needs to progress, and that too needs to evolve. But in addition to those generational conflicts, this is also a play about just individual conflicts. And part of this is connected to the Younger's living situation. Walter and Benita are often speaking across one another. They seem to have an inability to connect. Walter and Mama certainly don't understand one another because of what he wants her to use this money for, and I'll talk about that more today. But even Walter and his wife, Ruth, they have drifted apart. So in many ways, this is a family, ironically enough, in a contradictory way, that is united together because they're a family, but disunion in many ways defines them. And part of how I want to perhaps talk about the inherent tragedy of this play, because there are distinct tragic elements, is to think about how Act 2 ends and to see this family with this bit of hope, and how even just having a bit of hope is enough to fundamentally change the way these characters appear to us, the way they seem to be, the way they interact with one another, and then to see that taken from them by conditions that are, quite frankly, beyond their control. But this act begins with, and this is something I spoke about in the last lecture, this Benita romantic subplot and what it ultimately represents. Because on one side, there's a figure like Asagai, who represents, at the time, this fledgling fascination with Africa and an African identity for people of color. And the idea, and I summarize this briefly, and there's also information in your book, Africa was seen and understood at the time, because of certain political conditions, as this site of liberation for people of color, and perhaps even something genuine, something that has not been touched by the horrors of racism in the United States. But then on the other side, there's George Merchant, and he symbolizes or represents this assimilationist feeling and this assimilationist understanding of what it means to be a minority figure, in particular a black minority figure in a predominantly white country, the sorts of concessions that a figure like George must make to thrive and survive. And for Beneatha, it is not as simple as choosing a romantic partner. She's perhaps choosing an identity for herself. And we see here at the beginning of Act Two, Hainsbury both suggesting the fascination with Africana, but also offering perhaps a bit of satire, because I would at least encourage you to read all of this dancing and shouting. It all feels very tribal, and in particular, just how big and bombastic it is as a projection of how little Beneatha actually understands. She is in the process of learning all of this. And Walter, you could argue, is too, maybe not with the same sort of fervor and conviction as Beneatha, but I think what we're seeing in this moment here at the beginning of Act Two is both a picture of what this fascination with Africana looked like, but also a bit of satire and a bit of commentary on how individuals like Beneatha may have missed something, or at least within the play itself, she's missing something, potentially. That's one way to certainly read it. Now, I do think it's interesting because George arrives, and the moment George arrives, notice how all of this fascination with Africa and all of this Africana just immediately disappears. It's as if the presence of an assimilationist figure causes all of this, everything that Asagai represents, to fade or retreat into the background. But you might notice that Walter is interested in conversing with George, and George is clearly not interested in having that conversation, but Walter is also quite antagonistic towards George, and it's worth considering why he might harbor such antagonism. I think you could argue part of it is because he's quite simply jealous of a figure like George, and George represents what he, despite what he says, George represents what he wants to be. George represents what he aspires to, and we'll have a better picture of this near the end of the act. But George as well, and I think this is part of what Hainsbury tries to suggest, George does not seem to see any commonality between himself and Walter. He sees in many ways Walter as something fundamentally different and fundamentally separate. And the question I would invite you to ask, and I think maybe this is the question that Hainsbury is asking, to what degree is a figure like George so different from Linden at the end of the act? And Linden becomes an important figure in Act 3. Linden, just to remind you, he's the representative of the Clybourne Park Residential Welcoming Committee. Of course, there's something ironic, tragically so, about describing him as a member of a welcoming committee, because he's anything but to the youngers. But there seems to be distinct similarities between those two characters. Notice, for example, the amount of discomfort George has or expresses while in the younger's apartment. And in a moment like this, it's worth asking to what degree, and what does George, maybe a better way to phrase this, what does George find so fascinating and attractive about Beneatha, because he seems, to be quite frank, a bit revolted by her family. And I'll talk about George later in Act 2 because he says a few interesting things worth considering, but that's maybe a question worth asking as well. What does George want from Beneatha, and is there a way that characters like George and characters like Linden, even though there are distinct differences and important differences between the two, are they together, collectively, part of the problem? Now, there is this moment that I want to highlight. It's a small moment that Ruth and Walter share. And in it, Ruth in particular speaks about what these characters have lost. And this is on page 1490, and it's the middle of the page. She waits a long time and then with resignation starts to put away her things. I guess I might as well go on to bed, more or less to herself. I don't know where we lost it, but we have. Then to him. I'm sorry about this new baby, Walter. I guess maybe I better go on and do what I started. I guess I just didn't realize how bad things was with us. I guess I just didn't really realize. She starts out to the bedroom and stops. You want some hot milk? Hot milk? Yes, hot milk. Why hot milk? 'Cause after all the liquor you come home with, you ought to have something hot in your stomach. I don't want no milk. You want some coffee then? No, I don't want no coffee. I don't want nothing hot to drink. Almost plaintively. Why you always trying to give me something to eat? Standing and looking at him helplessly. What else can I give you, Walter Lee Younger? So, I think this is a nice moment for a couple of different reasons. I think moments like this show just how much skill a playwright like Hainsbury has. This is such a tender moment. This is such a sweet moment. But it's ultimately a tragic moment as well. There's so much subtext to this conversation. The amount of separation and distance between these two characters, but also Ruth and her earnest desire to care for and support Walter. You hear Walter often say, at least to this point in the play, no one supports me, no one cares for me. He accuses Ruth of this directly in Act 1, but what we're seeing here is that is clearly not true. And I think this is a dynamic that we often see between characters in stories who care for one another, but they don't know how to care for one another. Because Ruth clearly wants to help Walter, she's just incapable of doing so. And it's not because Walter doesn't want the help. It's partially because Walter's defined by a very narrow and very suffocating definition of masculinity, the kind of masculinity that both wants help and desperately needs help, but also rejects it, it seems, at the moment he gets it, because it suggests a kind of weakness on his part. So we see Ruth fighting that battle here, but I think we also see Walter fighting it as well, because it is worth having sympathy for figures like Walter, anyone who's dominated by and really suffocated by this very narrow definition of masculinity. So I think Hainsbury effectively allows us to feel sympathy for both of these characters, despite their faults, despite their flaws, despite what they've said to this point in the play. But I think this moment complements one of Hainsbury's main themes, this distance between people. And what's different, of course, between Ruth and Walter in comparison to Walter and Mama, or Mama and Beneatha, as you would think these two, there isn't a generational divide here. They're contemporary with one another, but despite all of the reasons they have to unite, they're separate. There's something that keeps the two of them from actually uniting, and it might be something as simple. And again, I think we see this near the end of the act or in Act 2, Scene 2. It might be something as simple as hope. The Youngers, like many African Americans, have fought and struggled for just hope, just the sense that they will have equal opportunity. And that's precisely why Mama makes the decision she makes with that insurance check, and it's worth talking about that now as well. So we learned that Mama takes the insurance check and she buys a house. She buys a house in a much nicer part of the city. And I won't again explain the connection Hainsbury makes to housing and social and economic mobility, but that seems to be why Mama does what she does. And Walter doesn't react too positively to this. He says, for example, on page 1494, "So you butchered up a dream of mine, you who always talking about your children's dreams." And it's worth discussing what Walter's dreams are. So Walter, I mentioned this earlier in the lecture, he wants to be, as he describes it, a man of business. He wants to be a businessman. He wants a secretary. He wants to wear suits. And it's interesting, he doesn't really have a sense of what this job will be. He simply wants the trappings and the signifiers of success, and understandably so, I think. And what his dream is to own a liquor store. He has two friends who will help him finance this, the three of them together. They have this plan to finance this liquor store, and Mama is understandably and predictably not too jazzed about this. She thinks it is an immoral way to become successful, to make a living, for a lack of a better phrase. But for someone like Walter, and I think this is part of Mama's criticism and critique of him, that he wants material and financial success, but as Mama sees it, he doesn't want and he's not interested in doing so ethically. Because for Mama, this is, again, a not so ethical way of being successful. So we're seeing once again this older, perhaps more antiquated way of thinking confronting this newer, more novel way of thinking. And the question that I always encourage my students to consider is, well, is Walter, is he right is maybe the wrong word, but is he on to something here? Is it possible, and we haven't met these two individuals he wants to do this with, we'll save that for later, but is Walter, is this concession he's prepared to make the sorts of concessions we need to make? If you are someone who's in the kind of situation the Youngers are in, is it more of a convenience than anything else to think about what is ethically and morally right? And I don't necessarily know if the play has a good answer to that question, but it certainly wants to ask it. And that's something I would encourage you to think about too. Maybe we don't like, just conceptually, in theory, what Walter wants to do, but we understand why he feels compelled to do it, while also understanding why a character like Mama feels compelled to agitate against it. So from here, we have this short scene, Act 2, Scene 2, and something significant happens here at the beginning with Benitha and George that I want to talk about. And I'll just read this exchange between the two of them. And I'll start with Beneatha's line, "Why are you angry?" Because this is stupid. I don't go out with you to discuss the nature of quiet desperation or to hear all about your thoughts, because the world will go on thinking what it thinks regardless. Then why read books? Why go to school? With artificial patience counting on his fingers. It's simple. You read books to learn facts, to get grades, to pass the course, to get a degree. That's all. It has nothing to do with thoughts. A long pause. I see. A longer pause as she looks at him. Good night, George. Beneatha has learned something extremely important here. I would argue she's learned that perhaps the main distinction between a character like Asagai and a character like George is conviction. George, he has ingratiated himself so much to this culture and this society that practically everything is meaningless. He has no real convictions to speak of whatsoever. Everything to him is quite transactional. And if you want to imagine that for someone like Hainsbury, she's also making an economic critique here, because many people, for example, have accused capitalism of not having any moral or ethical foundation whatsoever. Its main goal, its main drive is the accumulation of capital at any cost. And you can imagine that George, in many ways, sounds like the perfect capitalist. Everything is transactional. Thoughts, who cares about thoughts? The only thing that matters are transactions that allow us to succeed. That's not to say that Asagai is a perfect figure, but he does seem to have conviction, and he does seem to care about thoughts. And that seems to be the schism, or that idea has produced this schism between Beneatha and George. And you could argue in many ways this is, for Beneatha, the moment when she makes her choice. She understands that hewing closer to George, this kind of transactional assimilationism, is something that she simply cannot do ethically, morally. And this is important because this is one of the first moments in the play, as the play continues and then leads to an end, where characters within this family are confronted with making a choice that is simply convenient and transactional, as opposed to making a choice that has a moral and ethical dimension to it. And we'll see this idea surface a few more times before the end of the play. Now, we also see that Mama has made an interesting decision. She has opened a checking account, and she has placed a substantial amount of that insurance check in it and just given it to Walter as a way of christening him or inaugurating him as the head of this family, as the head of this house. And for someone like Walter, it's not just about having the money, but I think it's also, again, about having the trappings of success. And having a robust bank account is one of those trappings of success. But notice the effect that it has on Walter. After he and Mama speak, he has this encounter with his son. And I'm reading directly from 1498. This is what Walter says. He's speaking to his son, Travis. "You wouldn't understand yet, son, but your daddy's going to make a transaction, a business transaction that's going to change our lives." Just mark how many times Walter says the word business. This is so important to him, even though there's no sense that he really understands what a business transaction is. "That's how come one day, when you're about 17 years old, I'll come home and I'll be pretty tired, you know what I mean, after a day of conferences and secretaries getting things wrong the way they do, 'cause an executive's life is hell, man. the more he talks, the farther away he gets. And I'll pull the car up on the driveway, just a plain black Cadillac, I think, with white walls, no black tires, more elegant. Rich people don't have to be flashy, though I'll have to get something a little sportier for Ruth, maybe a Cadillac convertible to do her shopping in. And I'll come up the steps to the house, and the gardener will be clipping away at the hedges, and he'll say, "Good evening, Mr. Younger," and I'll say, "Hello, Jefferson. How are you this evening?" And I'll go inside, and Ruth will come downstairs and meet me at the door, and we'll kiss each other, and she'll take my arm, and we'll go up to your room to see you sitting on the floor with the catalogs of all the great schools in America around you, all the great schools in the world, and I'll say, "All right, son, it's your 17th birthday. What is it you've decided? Just tell me where you want to go to school and you'll go. Just tell me what it is you want to be and you'll be it. Whatever you want to be." "Yes, sir." He holds his arms open for Travis. "You just name it, son, and I hand you the world." So the first thing is, there is something so incredibly sympathetic about, even though this is delusional, there's something so sympathetic about hearing a parent just say, "I want to give my children anything and everything they want and desire." That makes complete sense. I think this has a way of recasting Walter and his priorities, because to this point he seemed incredibly selfish and solipsistic, but we see him here thinking about his son, thinking about his son's future. Now, I think you could argue perhaps this is just another reflection of Walter's solipsism or Walter's selfishness, because often children as progeny are extensions or a lineage of the father in many ways. So perhaps that's one way you could challenge Walter, but I think Hainsbury would almost want us to think and encourage us to read this in the most optimistic and generous way possible. But there is this interesting stage direction as Walter thinks and describes this. It's as if he's drifting farther and farther away from reality. And it's as if this idea that working hard and doing the right thing will lead to success and prosperity. Now I'm describing the American dream, and it seems as if what Hainsbury shows us here is just how seductive. It's like a drug. All you need to do is just engage that idea of the American dream, and it'll take you places, in your imagination at least, that you never thought you could go. But as we see at the end of this act, it's all a lie. Or if it's not a lie, it's not available to everyone. And it's extremely unstable and precarious. But here, and then as we transition into scene 3, I think it's worth noting just how Walter seems. He is such a different character now. He's happy, he's dancing, and again, just seeing how even the prospect of one's social and economic situation improving, how it just has this what appears to be physical or chemical effect on Walter. He is such a different person. All of that anxiety, all of that weight of not only needing to provide for his ever-growing family, but just the weight of being unsuccessful, and how, again, this rather narrow definition of masculinity causes individuals who are not successful to feel like complete and utter failures. All of that has disappeared. But it doesn't last long, and it's no surprise that it doesn't, because that seems to be one of Hainsbury's points, is that all of this success that people of color might experience in this country, it seems to only last for a moment, and then it's gone. And how it happens here is with this character, Linden, who I mentioned earlier. He's a member of the Clybourne Park Residential Welcoming Committee, and it's quite clear after he speaks for a couple of pages that he's not interested in welcoming them. He's interested in dissuading them from joining the community. And he says several rather awful things. And what's interesting about a figure like Lindner is that he is clearly racist, but he hides it in, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but he hides it in fascinating ways. For example, this is on page 1502. He says this near the bottom of the page. I want you to believe me when I tell you that race prejudice simply doesn't enter into it. It's a matter of the people of Clybourne Park believing, rightly or wrongly, as I say, that for the happiness of all concerned, that our Negro families are happier when they live in their own communities. Now, this idea that Lindner's articulating is separate but equal, right? Which is separate but never equal. And the things I talked about in the last lecture about redlining in cities like Chicago speak to the inequality of this separate but equal idea. And that's how Lindner frames all of this. This is not, as he suggests, about race and racism. This is about just people living lives the way they want to, and surely you understand that. I think it's interesting that both Walter and Ruth initially are not skeptical of him, but Beneatha is. And I would encourage you to think about what that might mean and what that might suggest. This is on the previous page, 1502. There's this stage direction. Beneatha is watching the man carefully. And even some of her lines of dialogue, there are stage directions. For example, she says dryly, yes, and what do they do? So Beneatha, she seems to get what this is about long before Ruth and Walter do. They understand eventually, but Beneatha gets it from the beginning. And I think that's fascinating because according to Walter, Beneatha is just a silly girl who goes to college and has these wild ideas about being a doctor. But I think this exchange in particular reveals and suggests that Beneatha pays far more attention than Walter thinks she does, and that her inherent skepticism is part of what separates her from a figure like George, because you could argue that Walter, especially if you think about that bit of dialogue I read from the end of Act 2, Scene 2, he's framing himself like an assimilationist figure, similar to George in a lot of ways. And we're starting to see, again, just the degree to which Beneatha is not like George, the degree to which Beneatha is not like Walter. She is a skeptical, potentially radical figure. And I think we see that here in how she just receives Lindner. Now, that's bad enough, but the scene in the act doesn't end here because, again, everything that was given to these characters, it was almost immediately taken away. We learn that Walter used all of this money to finance this liquor store, and one of his partners is now gone. And what we're led to believe, quite obviously, is that he stole this money. This was all a con, and now Walter and his family, they practically have nothing. And what this ultimately positions Walter to do as we enter Act 3, which I will discuss later this week, is whether or not he will take Lindner and the residents of Clybourne Park, whether he will take their offer. Because remember, I didn't mention this before, but Lindner discloses that as a communal effort to keep Clybourne Park white, all of the residents, or most of the residents, will collectively buy the home, thus maintaining this segregation between whites and blacks. And now Walter has his own ethical choice to make, whether to accept their offer, which in many ways is accepting the terms of separate but equal. It's accepting the terms of segregation. It's accepting the unambiguous racism that informs those ideas. Or whether to, and now without the sort of financial clout they had before, to live in this home, live in this community that they know now is quite hostile toward them and their presence in this house. And that's where I will pick up later this week with this choice, and most of Act 3 just grapples with this choice that Walter and his family, but principally Walter, must make. So until then, have a good day, and I'll talk to you later this week. Okay, hello everyone. I hope you are happy and healthy and well. In this audio recording, I want to talk about the final act of A Raisin in the Sun. And even though I won't do nearly as much summarizing of the overall play as I will in the second lecture for this week, I will make certain connections to moments from not only Act 2, but also from Act 1, because this is the third act. This is where the play in many ways culminates. And what I'll say is a way of reminding you of where Act 2 left us. This is a play that was thrust into a kind of unmistakable despair at the end of Act 2. We learn that Walter's ill-advised attempt to parlay his father's insurance check into a liquor store has gone about as poorly as a plan could, and one of his investment partners, if we wanted to be charitable, has left, and the feeling or the idea that we're left with is all of this was a con on that person's part. So they have this house, but they seem to have no way to finance it. And what's doubly problematic potentially for this family is the residents of Clybourne Park, represented by Linden, have offered to buy the house from the Youngers. And all of this, of course, both literally and symbolically represents this desire to maintain racial segregation. So for Walter to acquiesce or for Walter to agree to this would in many ways implicate him in the project of racial segregation. And in the last recording, I spoke about how this is positioning Walter in such a way that he has a choice to be either a hero, perhaps, or a villain, perhaps. And I'll talk about how the end of the play might configure Walter as a potential heroic figure. But before I do that, I want to speak a bit about Benitha and Asagai, because that's where Act 3 begins. And the feeling of despair, it's certainly carried from Act 2 to Act 3, and it's embodied in Benitha. And what's interesting, and it's worth remembering, that Benitha at the beginning of the play was something of a naive character. She's someone who seemed to bounce from interest to interest, activity to activity. She received criticism from everyone in her family for how flaky she was at times. But here in the beginning of Act 3, she seems far more realistic, perhaps even pragmatic. Some might say she's a bit pessimistic, considering everything she saw happen at the end of Act Two. But I think the interaction between her and Asagai is important. And I think where I'll start is with this declaration she makes to Asagai about how, frankly, powerless she is. And I am here on page 1511, I believe, top of the page. And Beneatha says, and again, she's speaking to Asagai, while I was sleeping in my bed, in there, things were happening in this world that directly concerned me, and nobody asked me, consulted me. They just went out and did things and changed my life. Don't you see? There isn't any real progress, Asagai. There is only one large circle that we march in, around and around, each of us with our own little picture in front of us, our own little mirage that we think is the future. Now, I would argue there's a few different ways to read what Beneatha says here. In particular, this reference to a mirage that we think is the future. You could imagine that Beneatha and Hainsbury here, again, are interrogating this idea of the American dream and perhaps the lie or the fantasy that is the American dream. I talked about this when I spoke about Act One, that this play, it's part of this collection of plays, and it's part of this preoccupation, this preoccupation that existed in this zeitgeist and still in many ways exists today, that attempted to understand the viability of the American dream, everything from Steinbeck to Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby. These are all ways of exploring, interrogating, and challenging the American dream. And Hainsbury, even though this came much later than those two texts, it's still asking a similar sort of question. Even a play like Death of a Salesman, again, it's asking a similar sort of question. So you can see Beneatha perhaps challenging the viability of the American dream. But if we wanted to be more precise and more specific, you can imagine that she's speaking a kind of truth that reflects the experience that many people of color in this country have experienced since arriving on this continent in 1619, that so much of their life is dictated and determined without their consideration, without their consultation. And I think it's doubly tragic because Beneatha's a woman who says this. So this is not something unique to people of color. I think you could argue that women as well have felt for quite some time, even though, of course, things have changed since the publication of this play, but women have historically felt underrepresented, not consulted, ignored in some ways. So Beneatha is perhaps speaking to this lineage of under or simply non-representation, but she's also speaking to how, I think for all of us, if we wanted to universalize this in some way, how for many of us we feel as if we operate and exist in this world where decisions are made that affect us, and it's so beyond our control. And I think for a lot of us, we feel that way as I'm recording this in April of 2020. Many of us are not socializing with our friends. Many of us, if we are working, our work is fundamentally different. It has changed in ways that I don't think any of us would have abided if we weren't forced to. And I think for a lot of us, we're left feeling as if all of this happened without our consent, and it happened in ways that were and continue to be beyond our control. So I think there's a way, even though for Beneatha and for Hainsbury, there's something quite particular about what they're saying and suggesting here, I think there are ways to make bigger and broader connections. But I think Asagai's reply is quite interesting and quite fascinating, because what we see with Asagai in this exchange is just how optimistic he is. And I think there's a difference between the perhaps naivete that Beneatha embodies earlier in the play and Asagai's optimism here, because there can be at times similarities, or maybe a better way to say it is that people often think of a word like optimism and a word like naive as synonymous with one another. And I can see why people would think that. But I think with Asagai, there's an important distinction to make between being naive and being optimistic. And I would bring to your attention what he says on the next page, on page 1512. He says, "Or perhaps I shall live to be a very old man, respected and esteemed in my new nation. And perhaps I shall hold office, and this is what I'm trying to tell you, Aleo. Perhaps the things I believe now for my country will be wrong and outmoded, and I will not understand and do terrible things to have things my way, or merely to keep my power. Don't you see that there will be young men and women, not British soldiers then, but my own black countrymen, to step out of the shadows some evening and slit my then useless throat? Don't you see they have always been there, that they always will be, and that such a thing as my own death will be an advance? They who might kill me even actually replenish me." And what I think is important about what Asagai says here, and at this point he's persuading Beneatha to come with him back to Nigeria, and if you actually read and study what happened in Nigeria in the mid-20th century, then you know this was a moment when Nigeria was fighting back against its colonizing oppressors, the British, and it gained independence in 1960. But for a figure like Asagai, it seems as if what he's suggesting ultimately is whether he's an old man who has very little, if any, significance, or whether he is, for a time, a significant person who, like most of us, perhaps clings to his power and his authority for too long and is then deposed. It doesn't really matter, because just his presence there is enough. His presence there helps to move things forward in a significant, sizable, and recognizable way. And what I think is interesting about what he says, especially in response to what Beneatha says, because Beneatha here, and I think all of us completely understand why she feels this way and why she says what she said. Beneatha seems to feel completely powerless, but I think the way Asagai tries to reconfigure how she thinks about this is to encourage her to think that, well, perhaps even in moments of failure, you can be productive, depending on the conditions and depending on where you are. Because Asagai, he qualifies this in an important way, because he says it's not a situation where I'll be productive and I'll be useful if there are British colonizing forces in my country, but it's only when we take this place back. And so I think ultimately what he's encouraging Beneatha to think is that there is hope, there is reason to be optimistic. And what's interesting is that to some degree this sense of optimism carries the play to the end. It's this external figure to the younger family, but he's also external to this country. He's not an American citizen. He's African, but he's not an African American. So it takes perhaps returning to, or even symbolically gesturing back to Africa for this family to see what it can be, to pull itself out of the trenches of despair, and to actually acknowledge, even if it's small, the sense of hope that still exists for them. So the remainder of the play is, again, this extended question, or a dramatization of this extended question. Will Walter accept the payment, or this payment from the Clybourne Park white community, and by doing so, actively support racial segregation? Or will he fight back, and will he choose to, along with his family, occupy this home, in many ways doing something and gesturing towards the civil rights era that flourished in the 1960s? And we're led to believe that at first Walter actually wants to acquiesce, which is to say he wants to take this money. But I think Mama does something quite interesting. And just a moment, I need to grab my book, but this is on page 1518. And at the very top of the page, Ruth, she's speaking to Travis, Walter and Ruth's son. And she says, "Travis, you go downstairs." To which Mama replies, "No, Travis, you stay right here. And you make him understand what you doing, Walter Lee. You teach him good, like Willie Harris taught you. You show where our 5 generations done come to. Go ahead, son." And I think what's interesting about this, because Mama, she does this thing, which is completely fascinating. So Mama, in many ways, has been a character throughout this play defined by an antiquated, which is to say an old set of values. Mama, in many ways, represents the past. But notice how, and I think this is a subtle but significant transformation for her, she is now gesturing towards the future, because that's precisely what Travis represents. Travis, as Walter's son, as his progeny, he is the future incarnate. And this is what children often represent symbolically, the future. And so Mama, it's not that she's left the past behind necessarily, but she has left the past behind insofar as she's prepared to see what value the present and the future actually has and holds. And by asking Travis to remain in the room, it's as if she's asking for the promise of the future to remain in the room. How, and to what degree will the future change based on Walter's decision? Because the future is, of course, undecided in many ways. What Travis becomes is still quite ambiguous at this point. And I think what Mama seems to believe and what Mama seems to suggest in this moment is this decision that Walter makes, it will have a profound effect on the future of this family. And I think if you wanted to just imagine this moment function symbolically, it will have a profound effect on the future for Black people in this country. And so to have Travis there, it's as if the future incarnate is watching the present. The future is watching what will allow it to be or to manifest, which is just fascinating. And this seems to trigger Walter in some way, because Walter is no longer interested in accepting Lindner's money, and by extension, accepting the conditions of what it means to accept Lindner's money. And what I think is fascinating is what Lindner says in response. And I won't read what Walter says because you can read it. It's on page 1518. In response to all of this, he says, "Well, if you are that final about it, there is nothing left for me to say." He finishes. He is almost ignored by the family, who are concentrating on Walter Lee. At the door, Lindner halts and looks around. "I sure hope you people know what you're doing." And if we had any question about Lindner's racism, and by extension, the racism of the white residents of Clybourne Park, I think that becomes quite clear here. Again, the use of language like "you people," that is language that has a particular racial tinge to it. But what I think is also interesting about this moment is how Even though, again, Lindner doesn't say this because Lindner rarely says what he means. You can read this as a threat, and I think that's how we're encouraged to read it. Because what I think is interesting about what Hainsbury does in this play, this is a play where this family has a moment of triumph. This is a triumphant moment for this family, but we must qualify that triumph in some way, because it's not like Luke Skywalker destroying the Death Star at the end of the first Star Wars film, where it feels like, oh, and everything, the world, this sense of normalcy has returned to the world. No, there are consequences for this decision, and Hainsbury wants us to know, even in this moment of exaltation, there are potentially dangerous, violent consequences to come. But that's not the concern, and that's not the preoccupation of this moment, because all of the happiness and jubilation that we saw at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 3, we're seeing it here again. Walter, in many ways, christened as this heroic figure because of what this decision ultimately represents, this radical decision, this potentially ethical decision, knowing what all of this might mean, knowing the potential dangers that this family might face by attempting to live in this predominantly, exclusively white neighborhood. It's as if it's only in moments like that when we know that what we are about to do could lead to something horrific and horrifying. It's only in those moments that we are acting and behaving ethically. And maybe the thing to think about is, are there times when the choices we make, if we are trying to do the right thing, if we qualify those choices, are we really behaving ethically? And I think what I mean by that is, imagine, for example, that you want to be, and you want people to think of you as a charitable person. So you donate money to charity, but you can't help but think in that moment while you're donating money to charity, look at me, I'm being a charitable person. I wonder if that calculation, if having that thought might strip that act or that gesture of its full ethical dimensions. And that's not to say that donating money to charity, regardless of why you do it, isn't good. But if we're thinking about what it means to behave ethically, I wonder if it's only in those moments when we know that what we're about to do, while being the right thing, while being the ethical act, could potentially lead to something awful and destructive for us, yet we do it anyway. Those are the moments when we're truly behaving ethically. And I think that's perhaps what Hainsbury might understand, and that's perhaps the calculation that Walter makes, even though, again, this is the complete opposite of a calculation. The calculated decision would be to take the money, but there are bigger concerns and there are bigger ideas for not only Hainsbury, but for Walter too. So I think I'll finish this discussion of the play for now, at least, with how the play ends. And it ends with everyone leaving, and then Mama remains, and she has the final line of the play. And she's speaking at this point directly to Ruth. All right, honey, go on down. I'll be down directly. And I'll read straight from the stage notes, or the stage directions. Ruth hesitates, then exits. Mama stands at last alone in the living room, her plant on the table before her as the lights start to come down. She looks around at all the walls and ceilings, and suddenly, despite herself, while the children call below, a great heaving thing rises in her, and she puts her fist to her mouth, takes a final desperate look, pulls her coat about her, pats her hat, and goes out. The lights dim down. The door opens and she comes back in, grabs her plant, and goes out for the last time. Now, I haven't mentioned this before, but this plant is significant, and I would encourage you just to think about the symbolic meaning or the symbolic significance of plants. And what's perhaps odd or ironic is that Mama tries to grow these plants. She basically tries to be a gardener, but in an environment that's not conducive for the growth of plants. And I think she actually makes mention to this. And we know that she's given these gardening tools, and the idea is that once they move into this new house, she'll have an opportunity to properly garden. And again, just think about what gardening represents symbolically, metaphorically. Having an opportunity or cultivating something out of the ground, placing roots, if you wanted to use a cliched idea like that, but I think it's appropriate here. But also, more than anything, having the space for fresh air, for sun, for water, rain, all of that. And that's something that this family has not had. Has not had. But by returning to get this plant, this is something of a continuation of this idea that Mama, in many ways, is defined by this want and desire to make a better life for herself, her family, maybe even by extension, her race. And this plant, in many ways, symbolizes that. It's this object that she can take with her to this new place in the hopes that this new environment will offer fertile ground and fertile soil for her to actually grow. And you can almost think of this plant as symbolically functioning as a dream of sorts, because many plants, as some of you might know, can be quite delicate and can only survive in certain climates and certain conditions. And what's interesting is that despite her environment and despite her surroundings, she's found a way to keep this plant alive. And you can imagine that by taking this plant with her, she's taking a symbolic representation of her and Big Walter's dream to make a better life for themselves and their children. So taking the plant at the end is an important gesture. So with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed A Raisin in the Sun. It is a thoughtful and provocative play. Okay, have a good day. I'll talk to you later this week.